are you doing today?
Well, I'm well, thank you. It's a beautiful sunny day here in London, Canada, and I'm enjoying the heck out of it.
Nice. I've not been outside so far today. It's been some early getting some stuff squared away, but I'm glad you could be here. Jim Chapman, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you, Justin.
So for our listeners, for our viewers that are not familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about uh, what you do, your career, and your past experience, kind of?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I'm 76 now. I've been quote retired for about 10 years, and as most retired people will tell you, I'm working harder than I ever did when I was employed. For most of my career, I was either a professional musician or a media guy and a writer. I had some success in both those fields. I never became a rock and roll star or anything, which was my dream when I was a teenager. But I had a good, solid career and put food on the table and had a lot of fun. And then in my 40s, I transitioned into the media and was lucky enough to get a couple real breaks, and ended up doing both radio and TV talk shows here in London, Ontario, which is about halfway between Toronto and Detroit. I
Okay.
did that for a number of years. I also became a writer and a columnist for a couple of newspapers and some magazines, and have written at this point 9 books on a variety of subjects. So that's who I am now. At the time of my heart attack, which was our Thanksgiving here in October in 1999, I was pretty much at the peak of my media career, and I was doing very, very well. I had the top-rated show in the marketplace, and as I said, doing radio, doing television, doing writing. I was out most weeks. I'd be out 4 or 5 nights at least, doing personal appearances and hosting things and MC jobs and all that sort of stuff that you have to do if you want to build a career, particularly if you go into it late in life like I did. I was over 40 before I got a shot at the media. So I worked extremely hard, which wasn't hard for me because was one of those type A plus guys, just go all the time. And ultimately that led to both my downfall and having this massive heart attack, and in a way what I refer to as my resurrection, not so much in a religious sense, but being brought back to life and getting a second shot at it.
Okay. I mean, that's a really good summary. Um, Obviously, you're here, so we were going to talk about um, your near-death experience. Um, when you say that it contributed, I'm assuming just stress and kind of overwork, because it was a heart attack that you had to deal with. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, it was. It was actually. I had an aneurysm. I had a aortic aneurysm just right next to the heart, and that's a little partly congenital. That problem does run in my family, and my mother died from the same thing. But it's very much exacerbated. The doctors told me by a stressful lifestyle, and you couldn't get much more stressful than mine was. Now it was fun. I'm not complaining. I had a lot of fun, and I did not mind the hard work, but the number of hours that I was putting in and the mental fatigue, because my media career was um, based on my knowledge of what was going on in the world. The kind of talk show that I did, both on radio and TV, and a lot of my writing too, dealt with looking at the world with an interest more in facts than feelings. So lots of people do have successful careers. It's all about feeling. Well, how do you feel about? I never did that. People would phone my show in response to. You say we'd cover something. Okay, now what do you think about this? And they'd phone. And the first time anybody ever said, "Well, I feel," I'd stop them right there. So I couldn't care less what you feel. I want to know what you think. So when you do that kind of show, you have to be hyper prepared. You have to know as much as you can about whatever the topic is. You have to be ready to go on a moment's notice and pull that stuff out of your brain to respond to a live call. And that is physically and mentally very stressful. Again, I was happy doing it. I loved doing it, but it was hard, and that's what the doctors say that was the primary contributor to what happened to me.
Yeah, it's very different times. If you just go back a couple of years, you didn't have the luxury of Chat GPT to sort of pull whatever whatever you need out
Oh
of the
gosh, no.
air.
No, and when I started, actually, went on the air in 1992, I actually at that point for a lot of stuff still had to go to the library. I'd go down to the library 2 or 3 times a week, and just pull books about things I knew. I guess I had a good staff, so they made sure I had good guests, and I always knew who was coming, or generally knew. So I can go and do the prep, and then slowly in those early '90s, then the internet took over, but still didn't have anything, and real search engines. It was more just kind of an electronic library. You still had to kind of know what you were looking for, but that was okay. And I've always been a reader. At that point, I had a personal library at home of about 4,000 books, mostly history and science and the kind of things that I needed. That's how I got the job, in a way, was that I did have this ability to comment on lots of things from a position of some knowledge. And when they interviewed me for the show, that came out very strongly. That they were very impressed by that. And as it turned out, that helped me a lot. But yeah, everything in those early days, particularly, it was just grinding. Sitting there for hours, going through books, looking for books, going to the library, making phone calls, talking to people. It was just a very busy job.
Yes. Um, what? So the event happened.
Yeah.
You mentioned the aneurysm. Um,
Yeah.
can you take us back to that day and kind of walk
Yeah,
through?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I went to the gym that morning. I had turned 50 just 2 months before and decided that it was time to get into shape. I'd never been a particularly physical guy. I didn't play sports or anything, but I recognized that my lifestyle was just too sedentary. When I was a musician, it was different because you're moving around all the time and you're playing 6 nights a week, and you're getting a lot of exercise doing that. But when I transitioned to this new career, I wasn't doing that. So I joined a health club, and I had a trainer, and about 6 o'clock in the morning, and this was our Thanksgiving Monday. I think it was the 13th of October that year. Ours is a little earlier than yours because we get cold up here faster. So I was there at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was very happy that day because I had been working on the track. I wanted to run a mile. I'd never done that in my life. I'd never run anywhere near that, and I'd been working up to it. So this day I decided just today I'm going to run the mile. I get on the track. I go around about half that distance, and I start getting real pains in my chest. But that's okay. I had them before when I was running. They say, oh, you just run through the pain. Okay, I'm going to run through the pain. So I did. The pain got worse and worse and worse, and then it kind of dissipated a bit. So I thought, okay. I did the mile. I finished the mile. Well, I'm so excited. Wow. So I go and do my regular workout, which is 40, 50 minutes, whatever it is. And everything I did on that, I did to excess. I felt so good about having done this. So I maybe was doing 25 reps of something. I did 30. And, or if it was 50, I'd do 60. And the last thing that I did every session was ab crunches, sit-ups. We used to call them sit-ups back in the day. And I would do 25. That's what my level was at. And I got to 25, and I said, heck with this, I'm doing 30. I did 5 more, and now it's really hard to do. I said, screw this, I'm doing 35. I just felt so exhilarated. And I did 35, and as I lay back down on the mat, something happened. A pain, but not a sharp pain, just, ooh, something's wrong. Something's very wrong here. And I struggled to get to my feet. I did get to my feet. And you've heard the expression, people who are having a heart attack will know this, of an elephant sitting on your chest. That's what it felt like. This incredible pressure, even though I was standing up. And there was a young fellow, one of the trainers came by and said, excuse me, just for a second, I think I may be having a problem. You just keep an eye on me for a minute or two. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, come with me." He put his arm around me and half carried me to there was a couch there, and put me on the couch. And he said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I don't know, but I don't think this is good." He said, "I'm going to phone an ambulance. I think you should do that." So they did. The ambulance came, took me to the hospital, got into the ER. I was actually having a chat with one of the nurses, because media guy, right? And we have a lot of issues here in Canada with our healthcare. And I had done a lot of programming about healthcare, and I thought this is a perfect opportunity for me to find out firsthand what it's like to go into the ER with a serious problem. So I'm going to stay awake. Now, they give you drugs and things to try to calm you down. Well, like I said, I'm an A double guy. That didn't slow me down. I'm staying alert. I'm interviewing this young nurse. Said something like, there are a lot of talk these days about the short staffing, and what's been your experience, and are you overworked? And she looked at me like I had three heads and said, "Excuse me just a minute," because a cardiac patient's not supposed to be talking like that. Went over to the doctor. I could see them talking. The doctor looked over at me, walked back across to the bed, looked down at me and said, "Mr. Chapman, are you okay?" And at that moment, it just really hit me, and I looked at him, and I verified with him later what I said. I said, "No, no, I don't." And I closed my eyes, because I was so weary, and I'd fought to stay awake. I was just overwhelmingly weary. I closed my eyes, I thought, just for a second, and boom, I was somewhere else.
Okay. So you're in the emergency room at this point, right?
Lying on the gurney in the ER, and they had the wire, the plugs and the tubes and all that stuff, and I'm all hooked up to everything, and suddenly I'm not there anymore. And the first thing I noticed was the silence. There was no noise, because ERs are very noisy. People are talking, and the bells are ringing, and people are hollering down the hall because somebody cut your leg out, whatever the heck. There's very noisy generally when you get into the operating areas. And suddenly it was absolute silence. And I opened my eyes because what the heck's going on? And I wasn't there anymore. I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was standing, instead of lying, I was standing on kind of a low, it was a very shallow, I don't even hesitate to call it a valley, but I will. It's kind of a valley kind of stretching away from me off to a hill on the other side, an indeterminate distance away, a few hundred feet probably. And I'm standing on the other side, the one side of it. I can see the far side. And I'm standing there, and as I look around, and well, I can see the sun shining, and I can feel a breeze on my face. There's a breeze. Well, that's interesting. And where the heck am I? And I'm looking around, and I noticed that instead of being green, everything was shades of brown, reddish brown, but not dried out or anything. It just looked quite normal, except where what would have been green was brown instead. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea then, but I did think almost immediately. I thought, I've died. They lost me. I died. There was no question in my mind. And I was fully awake, fully conscious. I closed my eyes because I couldn't stay awake. I was overcome with this feeling of weariness. So I'm standing there with the sun shining and looking over this strange landscape, and thought, I've died. They lost me.
And did you feel, you mentioned that you felt the breeze on your face. You could tell you were standing. Yeah. Do you still, so this is a very vivid experience. Did it feel the way that people describe kind of more real than real? More.
I think that, I've heard that. I've heard people say that. I don't think it was more real than real. It just felt, there was no doubt that I was somewhere. Let me put it that way, okay? It wasn't a sense that, I'm drifting, I don't know where I am and all that. I absolute sense that I was somewhere. I could see things around me. I could see the sun. I could feel the window on my face. And then as I'm standing there and thinking I've died, there's just kind of off to my left, I don't know, 10 feet away, there's a kind of a shivering. And I've often said it was all kind of like the Star Trek transporter, but it wasn't really. But it was kind of shimmering like that. And suddenly not suddenly, kind of like the transporter. Here comes an image, and it's my family. All members of my family who are alive. I never did see anyone who was deceased, but all the members of my family who were alive were there, and they were all looking extremely distressed and upset. And I thought, oh goodness, this is awful. I don't want it to. It's terrible. And then for the first time in this experience, and this happened again and again, there was, I like to say there was a voice in my mind, but that's not a good description. There was an awareness in my mind, and people talk about that, the still small voice of God speaking to you. My experience wasn't, and even now in retrospect, was not a religious experience. I don't speak of it in those terms, but that voice, whatever that was inside me, said, don't worry about them. They love each other. They'll be fine. And as I heard or felt, however that communication happened, imprinted itself on me, they faded away. And as they faded away, so did all my concern about the fact that, gee, I died and my family's upset and this is terrible. It all just went away. And then that voice, it's really hard to describe this because it wasn't words and it wasn't pictures. I don't know what it was, but I got an understanding from something else, because it sure wasn't me, that I was okay, that I was in a good place, and I started to experience, which many or most NDE people that I've spoken to or accounts I've read talk about feeling at peace and feeling comfortable and feeling just, warm and feeling loved and feeling like you're part of something great. And all of those feelings kind of flooded through me. And I started to perceive, and again, that's probably not the right word. It's very difficult to talk about because our language, the words in our language, do not adequately describe what I felt. It's very difficult. But so I say it was just kind of there. I started to get a sense of myself being part of something far greater. And this is very common, of course, as you will well know, in accounts like this, people feeling that we're part of something much greater than ourselves. And, of course, that's the underlying tenet of most major religions, is some version of that we are all part of a greater than ourselves. So I'm feeling this, but at the same time, I'm asking myself, and it sounds bizarre, but it's true, well, what do I do now? Okay, I'm dead. I'm standing here. I feel great. I'm not worried about anything, and I literally, am I supposed to stand here forever? And then I thought, well, that's a pretty stupid thing to say because, who knows what forever is at this point, pal? Okay, what will I do? And I started looking around to see if there were any signs, anything to tell me what to do. Is this way to heaven a sign? Or didn't know what I was looking for. Nothing, couldn't see anything. Well, I've heard, stories about tunnels and whatnot, and, going down a tunnel. Do you see anything like that? Nah, I don't. Well, what is there, a cave or anything? And I'm looking all around. No, there's nothing like that. And as the one part of my brain is dealing with, well, what do I do now? The other part is being filled with all of this wondrous experience, even is not the right word. This just, I guess, okay, it's an experience. Filling me with that, and I felt just so great, and I felt loved, and I felt part of something far larger than me, and I felt that I was surrounded by presences in plural, not one massive thing, but presences in all these individuals making up a group. I couldn't see anything at all. I got no communication that I could recognize from them, but I felt that I was surrounded by all these beings, let's say beings for lack of a better word, surrounded by all these beings. And what I was getting from them was, again, all this unconditional love and acceptance and peace and be at peace and all of that. It was astounding. And if I had just stood there, I might still be standing, or maybe in another reality I'm still standing on that hillside. But That's not what happened. Because, again, maybe because my personality is very action-oriented, very goal-oriented, I thought, I have to do something. I can't just stand here. Well, what are you going to do? I don't know. And I look across the field, across the valley, and there's a stream flowing. I can see this stream. And the stream is it's iridescent, like a snake, or like snake skins, some snake skins, or like oil on water, that kind of iridescence. But it didn't look like it was oily. It was just, the water was somehow sparkling with that. And I thought, that's interesting. Maybe we should go look at that. And as I'm looking down at the stream, I look up and I see a bright light on the far side, a couple of bright lights on the far side of the valley. And I thought, aha, okay. Now, I've heard and read about, seeing the bright light and you walk to the light, or it's just science fiction movie, don't walk towards the light. So I thought, well, what else am I going to do? So I start coming down off the hill. I'm getting close to the stream, and I remember thinking, well, I'm going to get wet. Wherever I'm going, is it going to matter if I get there and my shoes are wet? This is where my mind was. I was still very much me, the kinds of, sometimes silly things that we think, like, oh, what am I going to do if my feet get wet? Before I got there was a moment that in front of me, and it wasn't like the shimmering before. Suddenly there was a face in front of me. And I stopped because, there's like in front of me, I'm going to run into this face, just a face, nobody, just a face. And I stopped and I thought, oh, well, good. Somebody's come to tell me what to do. And I don't know if I articulated this to myself, but I think this must be some kind of angel come to guide me and to tell me what to do. So I stop and I look at and it was a young woman's face, early 20s, a pleasant looking young girl. And I stopped and she looked at me, and then she yelled at me. And she said, "Mr. Chapman, are you in there? Can you hear me?" And I was so absolutely shocked by that I blinked. Like you would, something like. And when my eyes opened, I was back on the gurney in the ER. And a young nurse with the same face was leaning over me. Now, as it transpired, I was gone for a few minutes, and they had a lot of trouble firing my heart up again. And the story I was told later was that they basically had said, okay, that's it. And this young woman, who, as the story came out later, whose mother was a big fan of my radio show, so I was told, said, oh, my mom loves this guy. Can we try one more? Now, I don't know whether that actually happened, but that's the story I was told by people who were in the ER. It is a lovely story, even if it's not true. One more, and they gave me one more, and then my heart started to beat, and that's when she yelled at me to, try to bring me back to consciousness. And there I was, back in the ER.
So when you woke back up in the ER after having that experience, how did you initially process it? What did you tell yourself had happened, or what did you feel like could explain that experience?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I take myself back to that. A lot of things that I'm telling you and that are in my book are there because as soon as I was physically able to do anything, I started making notes, talking into a tape recorder, whatever, to record all of the things, as many of the things as I remembered that I could, because I knew from experience as a reporter too that what you think you saw a year later, 2 years later, it can get fuzzy. You can convince yourself you saw things that you didn't see or hear things that you didn't hear, and we've all had that experience. You go back to your childhood home and it doesn't look anything like you remembered, although you were absolutely sure you remembered exactly, and it doesn't look like that at all. That kind of thing. So I made mental notes at first, and then I would talk to my family members and write this down. And so I could go back and recapture those moments. And what happened when my eyes opened, the young nurse was there. My first thought was, well, that was interesting. And the doctor was the ER doctor, who I later interviewed from my book. And I used to do a lot of speaking about this. I traveled all over from New York to Seattle and all around my area here in Canada, and did a bunch of network interviews in BBC and ABC, all sorts of stuff. I was very blessed to be able to share my experience that way. But so I talked to this doctor later on, and he told me, he said, he came to see me speak, and then afterwards he come up and said, "Good to see you again. Glad you're still alive." And he said that, I want to tell you something about, because you didn't really mention this much in your talk. See, when we resuscitated you, he said, I went over to, the nurse kind of yelled at you and then your eyes open, so which doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes you're in a coma or you're just unconscious for a while. He said your eyes opened right away. And he said, I asked you how you were doing, and he said, you were as cogent as you were when we were talking just before you closed your eyes and your heart stopped. And I wasn't sure what he meant. So I asked him, I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I've brought back hundreds, if not thousands of people like you who were dead. The heart stopped, brain stopped, flatlined. And fortunately, with modern medicine, we can bring back a lot of those people. High percentage of those people we can bring back. I said, I've done that hundreds, maybe thousands of times. I said, I can't remember. He said, it might have happened, but I can't remember. Anytime I was able to talk with somebody like I talked with you, and you were absolutely lucid and cogent, and you were right there, and we had a little chat about, okay, here's what's going to happen. And you know what happened to you? Yes, I assume my heart stopped, yes. He didn't ask me if I'd had any experience, not that I remember, but I'm as he's talking, I'm processing, well, something really interesting happened here. So apparently I've been dead for a while, and I remember very vividly all this stuff that happened from when I closed my eyes. So anyway, that was kind of the first few minutes, however many they were, and then again, suddenly I felt overwhelmingly weary, and I was gone again. And this time I was asleep. I'd had serious heart damage, and it was touch and go for me for 4 days. They didn't know I was going to survive or not. And finally, I got bad enough. They didn't want to operate. They were worried that the operation would kill me because my heart was that problematic. And it got to the point where it was either operate or just let me die. So my doctor and my cardiologist were there that morning. It was a Thursday morning. It's happened on Monday. They were there and consulting with the resident at the hospital who was in control of what was going to happen to me, and they prevailed upon him to contact the surgeon. My physician, my family physician, had been a surgeon and knew all the right people, and my cardiologist they were both friends of mine. In addition to being my medical guys, they're both personal friends. So they came every morning to see how I was doing. And this morning they said, we've got to do something. So they got the surgeon from upstairs who was prepping for another case, and he walked in the door. And I was out at this point, but I'm told. He walked in the door, looked at me and said, get him upstairs right now, and walked out of the room. So I had 2 more serious heart attacks, but eventually came back. And while I'm coming back is when I started to put together the book with the idea that I wanted, for myself, if for nobody else, I wanted to be able to remember what had happened. And that grew into one book, and then that grew into a second, much more comprehensive book, and that's the one that we published and did pretty well for us and is still selling okay. And all of that came out of my belief when I was awake and alert enough to evaluate what had happened. My belief that what had happened was genuine. What it was, I didn't know. Some people, it was, I saw Jesus, and I've heard lots of that, and I don't discount any of that stuff. Or, I did out of body, and I traveled here and there. I don't know if they did or not. I judge nobody's experience. All I can say about mine is I was absolutely convinced that something had happened to me. I'm going to jump in here just in case you don't ask me this, because I think this is really important. Some years later, I had an opportunity to talk to a fellow who was a family friend. I didn't know him, but he was a friend of cousins of mine, and he was a doctor, and we were visiting the town where my family lived, and there's some of them, and he lived there too, and they said he would really like to meet you. Great. So we went over there for tea. He lived in this beautiful old Victorian mansions, and we went over for afternoon tea, which was very nice. And he said, tell me your story. So I did. I told him pretty much what I told you. And he said, well, that's all very interesting, but I'm sure that you're aware of the theory that what happened to you was simply chemicals breaking down in your brain. That, that's a widely held view. It's not the only one, but that the chemicals, as you die, the oxygen stops, your blood stops, chemicals start to degrade, and that prompts all this electrical activity in your brain, and that's what you experienced was just all of that random electrons banging around in there doing what they do. He said, what do you think of that? And I said, well, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you this story. And I told him about the doctor, Dr. Bill. I said, Dr. Bill told me that I was 100% lucid, like seconds after my eyes opened, and we had a conversation. And he'd never had a conversation with anybody who was that wide awake. I think probably was the phrase I used. Never had a conversation with anyone who was that there, in the moment. And I said, so here's my question to the people who think that this was chemicals breaking down. Let's assume that was the case. Let's assume that my brain stopped functioning. These chemicals immediately start to degrade, as they do. We know that absolutely happens. That's not a theory. That's absolutely what happens. How then, after 3-4 minutes, or however how long it was that I was not there, and they bang my heart back, my heart finally starts again, how is it that my brain functioned apparently very coherently and cogently if all these chemicals had all broken down and triggered all this electrical foo-fra? How would you account for that? And he just smiled and he said, well, do you know what I do? And I said, well, I know you're a doctor. He said, yeah, I'm retired. I was the head of brain research, whatever. It was a term he had for it at the big university here in Canada. I was the head of that department of brain whatever. That wasn't the term. I really should look it up. I did write it down what it was. But anyway, he was the head of this in this major Canadian university, and they studied this kind of thing all the time. And I started to chuckle. I said, well, what do you think about what happened, about that explanation? He said, well, it doesn't apply in your case, does it? If it is true, it didn't apply to you. So what happened? I said, you're the doctor. I don't know. So that's kind of where we left it. But that's been my big response to people. And because I've done a lot of speaking, I've done a lot of traveling. I've spoken to probably tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people over the years. And often people will come up afterwards and talk to me. And it's a very common question, what do you think? That didn't really happen, did it? Or what do you think? Or science says, well, science can say what it wants, but I know what happened to me. And this guy who is a brain scientist just kind of smiled and nodded his head and said, I don't know. Since then, because that was 15 years ago at least, there's been a whole lot more research. Science has moved in all sorts of interesting directions. Quantum physics is taking us into places that we didn't know were places before. And all of that, for me, it's not proof of anything, but it certainly suggests strongly that there is way more that we don't know about ourselves and about consciousness and about, the universe itself. Way more we don't know than we ever thought. You thought years ago, oh, we don't know this, we don't know that, but we know all this good stuff. Well, the most modern science in a number of different fields, brain chemistry, and as I said, physics and quantum physics and all of that, they're discovering things every day that are just absolutely mind-boggling. So I look back at it, I say, I don't know what happened physically or spiritually. I don't know. And I don't know anybody if anybody said, I know exactly what happened to me, I wouldn't argue, but I'm not sure I would give a lot of credence to what they said. To me, it was a very real experience that had a huge impact on my life, and particularly after I wrote the second book and started to go out and do big, not tours, but go out and do, instead of Seattle, and I was in Texas and New York, and being invited to come and do these things. I talked to so many people who were kind of in the same boat as me. There were a lot of them who had very serious opinions about what I had. One very nice lady at a church, and I often spoke at churches. They'd have a big event like a anniversary or something, and have a big special service, and invite me to come as a special speaker, even though my message is not religious. And this lady said to me afterwards, I had a little reception, and she said, "I really enjoyed your talk today." And well, thank you. I'm pleased. She said, I had the same experience. Oh, well, that's good. And I'm glad to see you're still here. And people would say that a lot. I had the same experience, even if they didn't. There's all, as you know, Justin, there's all kinds of experiences. But it was all the same as you. Okay. And then they'd tell me, and it wasn't anything like mine. She said, okay. She said, but you didn't mention going to heaven. Did you leave that out? I said, no, I told you everything that happened to me, everything that I experienced. And she said, she started to get a little feisty, and she said, just a little short woman, elderly woman. And she said, well, when I had my experience, I saw Jesus. And I said, okay, who am I to say you didn't? Maybe you did. Fine, good for you. And but no, I didn't say it. I said, like, oh, that's wonderful. That must have been very comforting for you. And she didn't respond to that. She said, did you see Jesus? And I said, well, no, that wasn't part of my experience. And she went, well, and turned around and walked away. Like she was insulted that I hadn't seen Jesus. So there's that kind of experience. I'm sure she believes as strongly in what happened to her as I do in what happened to me. But I don't put those kinds of labels on it. I just know that it changed my life in so many absolutely profound ways. It changed the whole course of my life after that. I've lived another 26 years after that, which is a lot longer than I thought I would, and had a wonderful life, and a great deal of the satisfaction I got from my life came from the lessons that I learned when I was standing on that edge of that valley, and all these feelings and insights were just kind of washing over me.
I think that's a difficult thing for all of these NDEs and out of body experiences, is this sort of idea that even though there's consistencies in what people experience, such as a life review, you mentioned looking for like a tunnel, right, or a cave.
Yeah.
Everybody's experience is different, and it's really easy to sort of put your perspective on somebody else's experience, but we really don't learn what we need to about these types of experiences without hearing your story sort of unfiltered, if that makes sense.
That's exactly right. And I won't say I'm astounded. I was quite surprised that the first few times I experienced the sort of my way or the highway narrative. Here's what happened to me, and if that's not what happened to you, then nothing happened to you. And that is out there. There are people who are just bound and determined that they know exactly what happened and why, and so on and so on. And my response, again, as part of this sort of awakening, I refer to it in my book as a resurrection. I said before, not in a religious sense. And I maybe shouldn't have used that word in retrospect because it's created some confusion with some people. I meant it in the sense that it was a rebirth for me. I had a chance to start over, but not like a baby who knows nothing. I had a chance to start over as an adult who'd been through this profound, I will say spiritual, I'm not sure that's the right word, this profound experience that gave me these incredible insights into myself and into life in general. And it was just such an amazing thing. But I know, as does anyone who is paying attention to any of this, and I mentioned my talk shows were all about information. So I had assembled tons of information about all sorts of things jammed into my head. And one of the insights that offered me when I was thinking about this as I was recovering was, you're and I hadn't read much. This is the other thing. I didn't know much about NDEs before this happened to me. The little I read, I came, oh, that's all bushwell. That's nonsense. I just dismissed it. I don't buy that. So now it's happened again. I'm trying to make sense of it. And one of the things I realized was that if you look at, you get a medical text and say, okay, so-and-so has this. right? And it'll say, here's the prognosis. You're going to live, for the sake of argument, you're going to live for 6 months, and in 2 months your toenails will fall out. Whatever, all these things. They're just kind of averages of everything. Some people will live for 2 years with that. Some people with the same thing, they'll live for 10 years, because we are all profoundly different physically, even though we're all the same. No, we are not. And that's why different diseases affect people in different ways, because we're not. We're the same species, we're the same creatures, but we're significantly different. And with that insight, I thought, and people are going to process this equally differently, which certainly turned out to be the case. As you know, because you know a lot about this, you've talked to lots of people about this. There are incredible commonalities, right? Similarities, but everybody has their own, in my experience, everybody has their own little twist, their own little personal thing that happened. And I think if we want to learn more ourselves, because that's one of the things that I got out of this, is you need to constantly, it'd be a constant search for who you are. And the way you do that is by getting as much information about life in general, and how does that relate to you? What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? What can you make of that? How can you turn lemons into lemonade? Because that's a key thing to a happy life. How do you do that? You have to learn how to do that. And you're absolutely right when you say that we need to experience in its fullness, with no judgment, what other people have to say. And I've learned so much from I even learned from the, you didn't see Jesus, what kind of loser are you, lady? In that she was obviously very confident in what she'd experienced and what she believed, to the point where she was, she wasn't, didn't much care what had happened to me, probably didn't believe what had happened to me. And that's just fine, because in her case, it's not about me, it's about her.
Well, you mentioned writing the book as kind of a way to document your experience, and I'm sure share it with other people. I want to ask you a two-part question about that. So, the first question is, when you wrote the second book, and you said you're getting into more detail, what made you feel, I've got to get this out. I need to, put this pen to paper, and two, since the release of that book and the experience that you've had, how do you feel that your worldview has changed, the way that you look at, life itself and death?
That's a good question. Good questions. The first iteration of the book I wrote essentially for myself and my family and friends, to explain. No, explain's the wrong word. To make sure that all these notes and scribblings and recordings and stuff that I'd made as I was recovering, to make sure that they were not lost, and that I didn't lose my comprehension of what they meant. I've been a writer for much of my life. I've written 9 books, and I've written hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles. And one thing that you learn from that, I'm sure people have learned this without doing what I did, but you forget things. You'll write something, and you go back to it 30 or 40 years later, which I'm doing lately. Now I'm doing a bunch of different kind of retrospective things, and you realize that, well, okay, I don't remember. I'm writing something about something that happened, and I'm reading it as though somebody else wrote it. And that has happened enough to me in my life that I know that happens. And I know that I said earlier about, you're a kid and you go back to your childhood home and it doesn't look anything the same, even though you're absolutely convinced. You know where the door was, you know where the window was, maybe not. Well, I had that experience actually just a few months ago. Back to one of my childhood homes, and I had been there many years ago since we moved out. And it was, I don't know, but this time at least I went with my brother and sister who'd never been back. And they're going, well, this doesn't look anything like this. No, not just different paint or whatever, just the size of the roof, all of that stuff. So the first one, I wanted to make sure that I had it down on paper. So if my memory changed with time, I had that kind of touchstone. And so when I went back on the air, we had a big audience. Went back on the air. Many people were asking. Were asking about what happened to you and what would happen. They'd call be in the middle of a topic and somebody would phone and say, tell us about what happened to you. So eventually I said, okay, I'm going to tell you the whole story, and I did, and we got tremendous response to that broadcast. So writing it all down, get the book. People want to buy the book. So we had a publisher, and we sold a whole bunch of books. It was a small Canadian bestseller, and money went to charity. That was great. That was super. Time goes by, 2, 3, 4, 5 years go by, and I realized that all of the things that I thought I knew about myself, or many of them, and the insights into how to, live a more fulfilling life, to, don't sweat the small stuff, stop all this, hard charging stuff. I drifted back into that because I was still building a career in the media. You never stop building. You don't just get there. At least I didn't think. I saw guys do that, and I saw them kind of wither on it. But no, you every day you're looking for a new challenge, and a bigger audience or something. That's what you do. And so 5 years later, I was coming back from doing a couple of speeches in Seattle. It was a long way away from London, Ontario. And I was very ill when I went. I should never have gone. I was quite ill, but I didn't want to let them down. And by the time I was on the plane coming home, I was really in bad shape. I had to get a wheelchair and all sorts of things. But we had a rough landing, and at some point during that, I thought, well, I don't care. I'm done. Plane can crash or not. And I realized when I got home that was kind of an epiphany for me, because why was I was physically ill, but I was mentally not well either. Why? Like, what had happened? And I started to review. Geez, I'm right back to where I was in 1999. The same guy I was in 19. It wasn't true. My personality changed. I was kinder. I was more thoughtful towards people. I was more willing to hear, opposing opinions. Not that I wasn't before, but I was more open to people. So that hadn't changed. But I was back to this, just 14-hour, 16-hour days banging away. And at that point, I thought, I need to, for my own mental health, I need to recount that whole story to me, not just what's in the first book and what I remembered. I need now, with 5 years of perspective on it, and still having all the facts. I still have the little book. And there were a lot of things I didn't put in that book, but I still have them. I thought, you have to do that if for yourself, if for nobody else, you have to write the definitive story, the whole story, right up till now, when you've had the second resurrection, where you've gone, okay, that it didn't entirely take the first time, but from here on in, I know what I'm doing. So I wrote that book, and any writer will tell you that, except people who are lying, writing is a very tough business. It's very difficult, and I've written millions and millions of words for pay in my lifetime. I've written 9 books, and 8 of those books were like pulling teeth. It's just a tough grind, particularly the nonfiction ones, because you have to research and verify and do all that stuff. This book, I wrote, the last book I wrote was a musical history of this area of the world here in Ontario. And it was COVID, but it took me thousands of hours and 3 years to write that book. The book of my story, which is called Come Back to Life, it took me less than 3 months. I just sat down, and it was almost like somebody was just whispering in my ear, and I'm just writing it down. Now, the somebody was me. I'm not saying that, it wasn't all my stuff, but it came out so quickly and so easily. And normally I do 10, 12 different edits, major edits, rip it apart, redo it. I don't know if I did 1. I don't know if I did any more than that, because it just didn't need it. It was just there. And it was so much of what I felt and experienced, and it was all done in the first person, and that for me was a catharsis that just I did away with the old Jim Chapman. He was absolutely gone. That, hard charging, win the next battle, win the next fight, whatever it takes to. That guy was finally gone. And so for me, that second book, which incorporated a lot of stuff from the first book. And I said that in the beginning of it, said, if you read the first book, you're going to hear some things or read some things you read before. You're going to read a lot of stuff you haven't read before. Please excuse me for repeating myself, but I have to tell the whole story. So for me, at the end of that, there's a number of things at the end of the book about insights that I had about their kind of principles for living, and I recount them at the end of it, and those are the principles by which I live my life. Now, I went back to the media for a few years. Career continued to get better. Eventually, just time to retire from that, so I left that and went and did some other things that I'd wanted to do all my life and did them, and then got to the point, again, my health was not good because I had heart issues, and by this time I was in my late 60s, and so I retired again and then started doing things that I really wanted to do. And I work long hours now too, but it's every second of it is fun, and I will not allow myself to put myself under pressure. I won't commit to do things that I know I can't do. I can absolutely do that with no stress, or I won't take the project on. So my life is full of projects. I'm loving them all. It's fantastic. And all of that, my serenity now, and that's exactly the right word, my serenity comes from writing that second book and just getting everything out. And I've had many people tell me, people who know me, who've read the book, I think overwhelming comment they make after, I hope, I really enjoyed it. Well, two things. That I couldn't put it down, which as a writer, that's the most wonderful compliment you can ever get. Nobody's ever said that about any of my other books. Couldn't put it down. Read it straight through. Took me 4 hours. Stayed up all night reading. The second thing is, reading that book was like you were just sitting there talking to me. It sounded exactly like you. And again, as a writer trying to communicate something personal, that's an absolutely wonderful comment to hear. Now, I was up for dinner last night, in fact, and there was a young fellow at the table that I didn't know. I'd seen him, things before. He serviced in France. And at one point during the evening, we're talking about how he came to be with this bunch of people. And he said, you don't remember, but I bought your book a few years ago, and I met you somewhere, and you signed the book for me. I said, no, I hope you enjoyed it. And he said, I read it then, and he said, in the last year, I've read it twice again, 2 more times, because some years had gone by, and so I was having some personal challenges and so on. And when I read it the first time, I was so relieved. He said, that I'm not afraid of dying anymore, because that's a big element of my book. I explore why I am not at all afraid of dying, and I was terrified of for the first 50 years of my life, terrified, for a whole bunch of reasons that I talk about in the book. He said, like you, I was terrified. I read your book. I was fine. He said, all of that disappeared because everything you said made sense to me, and the conclusions you drew made sense to me. He said, but the other thing is I found it really spiritually uplifting. And again, as a writer, I mean, I didn't set out to spiritually uplift anyone. I wrote it to sort of capture my own spiritual uplifting for myself. He is not the first. In fact, he's probably not the 200th person to say things like that to me about the book. So for me, when I look back and then come back to the question, how has it changed things? Putting that book on paper, looking at my insights, analyzing my insights, rethinking some of the earlier ones. What did that mean? It was absolutely the turning point in my life, and that gave me, to this point, it's been about 20 years since it was published, that gave me 20 pretty wonderful years, freed of all the pressures that I had before, freed of the fear of dying, freed of the fear of what will tomorrow bring, or what if this horrible thing happened? All of those things that we spend way too much time worrying about. And so it was kind of the catharsis for me to be, and I don't, that's going to sound kind of sappy and over the top, but it's true. It's kind of a catharsis for me to become a new person, a person I like a lot more. I didn't mind the old guy, but I like this guy a lot more. And this guy's having as much fun as the old guy did with none of the stress, none of the headaches. So it's been, the whole experience to me was an absolute blessing. Oh, there were times along the way when I didn't see it that way. But I look back on it and I was so blessed to have had that happen to me the way it did, and everything that followed from that. And just, I've had people tell me that it was the worst, and people I know who've had near-death experiences say, that having that heart attack or that car crash or whatever, it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and so on and so on and so on. And I never argued with them, of course. But I think to myself, well, I'm just the other way. I was really sick for a long time. I went through a whole lot of pain because my heart was very badly damaged. And, it physically changed my life. And, it was not a happy experience, but it sure was a happy experience. As it turned out, I'm so grateful that it happened to me. And it has allowed me to, as I say, enjoy a basically stress-free life. Not because there isn't stress in my life, but because I don't allow it to stress me. And I don't think there's any shorter path to happiness and fulfillment than to learning how to do that.
Well, I would normally say I'm sad that we're running short on time, and I am, but I think that's a great ending that you just gave. But let me ask you this: for people who hear this and see this this episode, first, what would be your message to those people about death, and secondly, tell us where people can find out about your work, reach out to you, see what's going on in your life. Are you still doing things like that? Are you still doing? I mean, you're speaking with us today, so I assume you're open to it. But are you still doing speaking engagements?
I don't do as much. Yeah, I don't do as much as I used to because I don't, quite frankly, get the invitations I used to because I don't have I used to have a staff, and they handle all this stuff, and they do promotions and all sorts of things. Because that's when you're a media guy like I was, that's how you do it. So when I first started to do this, my staff did all that stuff, and I had to turn down things. Well, I hated to turn down anything, but I had so many. But over the years, that's changed, and I retired a couple different times, and so I do still get called from time to time, and I do go and give talks. I also developed a thing I call the 25-hour day, which is kind of a way to deal with life and with stress in life, and I did it at a point where I thought this might be more useful to people if I beyond the book, if I kind of took it's a part of the book and simplified that. So I still go and do those presentations too. I did one just a couple of months ago, and they're very rewarding too. They're basically how to deal with stress, how to handle it in your life. And lots of people have written books about stressful, and I've read a bunch of them, and it's not like that. It's just really super practical. And here's how I figured out how to deal with it, and here's how to do it. So yeah, I still do that. I'm happy to do interviews. I love doing them. I love sharing. I hope it came across my excitement about being alive, because I am. And, I have some pretty serious challenges in my life right now that 20, 25 years ago would have, devastated me. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. Off we go. Just keep going. Okay, just keep going. Keep going. Keep walking for them. Keep smiling. Keep walking. So if people, I'll answer the first part in just a second. The second part is if people would like to know more about any of this, you can go to my website. It's www.jimchapman, jimchapman.ca for Canada, because I'm Canadian. So jimchapman.ca, and they get to my website, and there's a bunch of stuff there. But if they click on the bookstore, there is a section there that says the bookstore. Click on the bookstore, and that will take you to the page where a couple of my books are there, and one of my CDs, and they can click on that, and that'll give them all the information and how to order a copy if they'd like to have one. I'm happy to send them one. What is my summation for people? That's one of the Justin. I got to hand. That's one of the toughest questions I've ever been asked. People say, "Well, what do you think at the end of that?" Just the way you put that. I think that we're all different. So what worked for me may not work for other people, but by the same token, I know how much I've learned from other people. So if you feel that you're lost, that your life doesn't have the meaning you want it to have, if you are frightened of what comes next, when the light in this room goes off, is the whole house dark? My belief is no. There's a light on in the next room, and you go to the next room. That's what I believe now. If you are just kind of lost and lonely, I don't have any magic solutions to anything. I don't. I'm not here trying to sell books. The books are there. I think they might help people who are in that situation. But for me, I'm a happy guy. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid to live. I'm not afraid to live every day to the fullest. And I really don't think, as much research as I did and as much thinking about life and all the stuff that I did, I don't think I would be where I am today if I hadn't embraced those ideas that you live fully, you live your life, you don't fear your death. You don't allow things that aren't important to impact you. You just don't, and I'm talking about worry. You don't do that. And there are strategies. People say, "Oh, I can't. So how do you stop worrying?" There are definite strategies as how you can make that happen, and they are in the book too. So that's pretty much it. It's www.jimchapman.ca, and I'm a happy guy. And if listening to me today has interest any of your listeners and they'd like to know more about why, well, there it is. That's how you can find out. And I'm so pleased to have lived this long. I'm pleased to have been able to talk to so many people. I'm super pleased that you contacted me. I was quite surprised, and I know your reputation. I know the kind of work that you do. I was surprised and very gratified. So I want to thank you so much for having me on your program. And I just say, if there are any final words for me, it's supposed to keep smiling and keep walking. As my dad used to say, keep smiling, keep walking, and everything will work itself out.
I think that's great advice, Jim, and we really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, and just being a part of our program. It means a lot to us, and thank you again for doing this.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and if you'd ever like to do it again, I'd be happy to talk to you again.